The photograph measures 8 inches by 10, mounted on brittle cardboard that smells of mildew and decades. A black woman in a starched white nurse's uniform stands between two small children wearing oversized hospital gowns. The nurse's hands rest gently on their shoulders. All three faces are solemn, unsmiling, as was common in photographs from the era. The boy on the left, perhaps 5 years old, wears something around his neck. A cardboard tag, the kind hospitals used for patient identification. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would make you look twice. Until you do. The curator at the Tennessee Medical History Museum leans closer with her magnifying lens, and the neat hospital script she expects to see isn't there. Instead, cramped handwriting fills the tag. Numbers in sequence, and below them, a single word that doesn't belong in any patient file. Return. She photographs the tag, enlarges it on her computer screen, and realizes she's looking at evidence of something that was never supposed to be found. This isn't a portrait of healing. It's documentation of a crime that saved lives. Dr. Sarah Vance received the call on a Tuesday morning in March of 2019. A woman named Dorothy Mills wanted to donate her late mother's estate to the museum. Not unusual. The Tennessee Medical History Museum in Nashville accepted donations regularly. Old surgical instruments, nursing textbooks, physician journals. The material culture of American medicine, preserved in climate-controlled storage. But Dorothy Mills mentioned photographs. Hundreds of them. Her mother, Irene Caldwell, had worked as a hospital administrator in Memphis during the 1930s and 40s. She'd kept meticulous records of everything that crossed her desk, including glass plate negatives and early photographic prints from the hospital's segregated wards. Sarah drove to Memphis that Friday. The Caldwell house sat in a neighborhood that had once been white and prosperous, now ringed by newer construction and repurposed storefronts. Dorothy, a woman in her 70s with careful gray curls, led Sarah through a living room that smelled of lemon furniture polish and old paper. The photographs filled 3 cardboard boxes in a back bedroom. Sarah lifted the first print carefully. A surgical theater, circa 1920. White coats and ether masks. The next showed a maternity ward. The third, an X-ray machine with a technician demonstrating its use. Standard archival material. Valuable for research. Nothing extraordinary. She was halfway through the second box when she found the photograph that would consume the next 8 months of her life. The image showed a segregated ward. She could tell from the peeling paint visible in the background, the narrow iron beds pushed close together, the absence of the modern equipment visible in other photographs from the same era. A black nurse stood between 2 children. The composition was formal, almost ceremonial. Something about it felt deliberate in a way the other snapshots did not. Sarah set it aside and continued cataloging. By the end of the afternoon, she had selected 47 images for acquisition. The nurse portrait was among them. Memphis in 1923 was a city of 200,000 people, divided by law and custom into worlds that rarely touched, except through labor and violence. The Mississippi River carved through its western edge, bearing cotton and timber and the wealth built on both downstream to New Orleans. Beale Street thrummed with music that white tourists came to hear, staying carefully within the designated entertainment district before retreating to their hotels. Memphis General Hospital occupied a full city block on Madison Avenue. The main building, 5 stories of red brick with white columns, served white patients exclusively. Behind it, connected by a covered walkway but separated by every measure that mattered, stood the colored ward. 2 stories, 40 beds, staffed by black nurses and orderlies under the supervision of white physicians who rotated through on unpredictable schedules. The colored ward treated everything the main hospital did: pneumonia, tuberculosis, industrial accidents, childbirths, but it also housed something else: a research program funded by a medical school in Baltimore, studying nutritional deficiencies in Negro children. The stated goal was improving public health outcomes. The actual methodology involved controlled deprivation, withheld treatment, and careful documentation of how young bodies responded to systematic neglect. This was not unusual. Medical experimentation on Black Americans had been standard practice since the plantation doctors of the previous century. What made Memphis General notable was the efficiency of its pipeline. Poor families, most of them sharecroppers displaced by the mechanization of agriculture, arrived in Memphis with sick children. A clinic offered free treatment. Parents signed consent forms they could not read, written in language that obscured what consent actually meant. The children were admitted to the colored ward. Some were treated and released. Others became subjects. The study's principal investigator was Dr. Howard Prescott, a graduate of Johns Hopkins who believed intelligence could be quantified through skull measurements, and that the Negro race represented an earlier stage of human evolution. His papers were published in respected journals. His work was cited by other researchers, and the children in his care were recorded only by numbers, not names, in the ledgers he submitted to his Baltimore funders. Nurse Cora Elizabeth Bennett began working in the colored ward on April 12, 1923. She was 26 years old. Cora had trained at the Freedmen's Hospital School of Nursing in Washington, one of the few institutions in the country that accepted Negro women for professional medical training. She graduated third in her class of 18. Her instructors noted her meticulous attention to detail and her tendency to ask questions that made some of them uncomfortable. Why did post-surgical infection rates vary so dramatically between white and colored wards when the procedures were identical? Why did charitable hospitals in Negro neighborhoods receive a fraction of the funding that white institutions did, even when treating larger patient populations? These were not the questions a Negro nurse was supposed to ask. She returned to Memphis, where she had grown up, because her mother was dying of diabetes and needed care. After the funeral, she applied for positions at 3 hospitals. Memphis General was the only one that responded. The pay was $12 per week, $4 less than white nurses received for identical work. She accepted. The colored ward's head nurse, Mrs. Ida Freeman, was a woman in her 50s who had worked at Memphis General for 22 years. She showed Cora the ward on her first day: 40 beds in 2 rooms, a supply closet that was kept locked, a small office where nurses could write their notes. And at the far end of the second room, separated by a curtain, 6 beds designated for Dr. Prescott's research subjects. "Those children are not our responsibility," Mrs. Freeman said. Her voice carried a weight that suggested this was a rehearsed phrase. "Dr. Prescott has his own protocols. We provide basic care only. We do not question his methods. We do not discuss his work with anyone outside this ward. Is that understood?" Cora understood perfectly. She worked morning shifts, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., 6 days a week. Her duties included administering medications, changing bandages, assisting with minor procedures, and maintaining patient records. The work was routine. The routines were designed to be invisible. Behind the curtain, the 6 research beds were occupied by children between the ages of 4 and 9. They were fed according to strict schedules, their meals weighed and recorded. Blood was drawn twice weekly, height and weight measured daily. They were not allowed visitors except during a brief window on Sunday afternoons. when parents could observe them through the curtain but not touch them. Contamination risk, Dr. Prescott explained. The study required controlled conditions. Cora watched. She noticed things. She noticed that the children behind the curtain grew thinner, while the regular patients gained weight on standard hospital meals. She noticed that 2 of them developed skin lesions consistent with pellagra, a nutritional deficiency disease. She noticed that when a 4-year-old girl named Emma became too weak to sit up, Dr. Prescott recorded the observation in his notebook and did not change her treatment protocol. She noticed, and she said nothing. Silence was survival. Dr. Prescott arrived at the colored ward every Tuesday and Thursday morning, carrying a leather medical bag and a bound notebook with a marbled cover. He was 43 years old, unmarried, a man who lived in a boarding house near the medical school and devoted himself entirely to his research. His colleagues considered him brilliant, if somewhat single-minded. His papers on racial differences in disease susceptibility had earned him a reputation as a rising star in the field of eugenics. The study he conducted in Memphis was titled Nutritional Requirements and Metabolic Differences in the Negro Child, a controlled longitudinal analysis. The premise was simple. If Negro children could survive on fewer calories than white children, as some researchers theorized, then public health programs could reduce costs by adjusting rations accordingly. Significant policy implications. Substantial funding from the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. The methodology was systematic starvation. Children admitted to the research beds received meals calculated to provide exactly 60% of the recommended daily calories for their age and weight. No supplements. No exceptions. Dr. Prescott weighed their food personally, recording each meal in his notebook. When the children cried from hunger, he noted it as evidence of reduced psychological adaptation to nutritional stress. When they became lethargic, he measured their response time to stimuli with a stopwatch. When their gums began to bleed from scurvy, he photographed the lesions for his documentation. From Dr. Prescott's research notebook, entry dated May 19, 1923. Subject 4, male, age 7, day 38. Weight loss of 9 pounds from baseline. Exhibits minimal verbal response to questioning. Skin turgor poor, conjunctiva pale. These findings support hypothesis that metabolic efficiency in Negro children increases under caloric restriction. Will continue current protocol. Subject 4's name was Thomas Mercer. His mother had brought him to the clinic with a persistent cough. She had been told the hospital would cure him. She signed forms she could not read. She visited on Sundays and watched through the curtain as her son grew smaller and quieter. When she asked nurses why he was losing weight, she was told the doctors knew best. When she asked to take him home, she was told the treatment program required a minimum stay of 12 weeks. When she demanded his release, a hospital administrator informed her that the consent forms she had signed gave Memphis General temporary custody for purposes of medical care. She stopped coming to Sunday visiting hours. Some parents did. Cora watched Thomas Mercer fade. She changed his sheets when he was too weak to control his bladder. She held a water cup to his lips because his hands shook too much to grip it. She recorded his declining vital signs in the chart that Dr. Prescott reviewed each week with satisfaction. And every night, she went home to the room she rented in a boarding house on Hernando Street and tried to sleep. The mathematics were precise. 6 children behind the curtain at any given time. Study duration of 12 weeks per subject. That meant Dr. Prescott cycled through 26 children per year. Some survived the protocol relatively intact, their bodies resilient enough to recover when they were finally released, and went home to normal meals. Others left the hospital permanently damaged. Stunted growth, weakened immune systems, developmental delays that would follow them the rest of their lives. 3 children had died during the study's first 18 months. The deaths were attributed to complications from pre-existing conditions. Dr. Prescott noted in his reports that subjects with underlying health issues should be excluded from future trials. He did not stop the research. The children arrived through a carefully constructed pipeline. A clinic on Beale Street, funded by a Methodist charity, provided free medical care to Negro families. The clinic's director, Dr. Samuel Marsh, was white, 57 years old, a physician who genuinely believed he was helping the community. When children presented with malnutrition, chronic cough, or signs of rickets, he recommended admission to Memphis General for comprehensive treatment. He signed the referral forms. He explained to parents that the hospital had a special program for children who needed intensive care. He assured them that their children would receive the best medical attention available. He believed what he told them. He had been told the same lies by Dr. Prescott, who had assured him that the research program was strictly observational, that no child would be harmed, that the data collected would improve health outcomes for thousands of Negro children across the South. Dr. Marsh never visited the colored ward. He never saw what happened behind the curtain. His ignorance was willful, but not malicious. He was a good man serving a machine he did not understand. The consent forms were drafted by hospital attorneys. 8 pages of dense legal language explaining that admission to Memphis General constituted voluntary participation in medical research, that all procedures were approved by hospital administration, that parents waived liability for any outcomes related to experimental treatments. The forms were signed by parents who could read but not parse legal terminology, or by parents who could not read at all and were told by clinic staff that the forms were standard admission paperwork. No one explained that experimental treatment meant withholding food. No one mentioned Dr. Prescott's theories about racial differences in metabolic efficiency. No one told parents that their children would be measured, weighed, photographed, and studied like laboratory specimens for 12 weeks while their bodies consumed themselves. The machine ran smoothly because everyone involved saw only their own small part. Dr. Marsh saw referrals to a reputable hospital. Hospital administrators saw a funded research program that brought grant money and prestige. Nurses saw orders they were required to follow. Parents saw authority figures in white coats who spoke with confidence about medical necessity. What would you do, working in that ward, watching children suffer, knowing that speaking out would cost you everything? Cora Bennett asked herself that question every morning when she put on her uniform. The answer was supposed to be silence. Silence kept you employed. Silence kept you safe. Silence was what Negro nurses learned in training, the unwritten curriculum that mattered more than anatomy or pharmacology. But silence had a price that Cora found increasingly difficult to pay. It began with pencils. Cora brought colored pencils to the ward on a Monday morning in late June. Small ones, the kind sold in 5 and dime stores, cheap enough that no one would question their disappearance from her meager salary. She gave them to the children behind the curtain during her rounds, not during Dr. Prescott's scheduled visits, not when Mrs. Freeman was watching. Just during the quiet hours of late morning when the regular ward patients were napping and the research subjects sat in their beds with nothing to do but hunger and wait. The children drew, on the backs of discarded medical forms, on the margins of newspapers, on any surface they could find. They drew houses, they drew families, they drew themselves, always larger and fuller than they currently were, their crayon selves round-cheeked and smiling. a small rebellion, harmless. Except that it reminded Cora that harmless actions could accumulate into something larger. She began keeping notes, not in official records. In a small notebook she carried in her uniform pocket, she recorded the children's names, their admission dates, their parents' addresses when she could obtain them from the intake files. She noted symptoms, weight loss, lethargy, rashes. The progression of malnutrition that Dr. Prescott documented as data, she documented as evidence of harm. On July 18, 1923, a boy named Daniel Price collapsed during his morning vital signs check. He had been in the research program for 7 weeks. His weight had dropped from 43 pounds to 31. He was 6 years old. Cora found him on the floor beside his bed, unconscious, his pulse thread-like and irregular. She called for Mrs. Freeman. The head nurse examined Daniel quickly, then sent Cora to telephone Dr. Prescott at his boarding house. By the time the doctor arrived, Cora had started an intravenous line and was administering glucose solution, a standard emergency treatment for severe malnutrition. Daniel's eyes fluttered open. His breathing stabilized. Dr. Prescott was furious. "Did I authorize intravenous glucose?" His voice was controlled, each word carefully enunciated. "No, sir," but he was in shock. What he needs is immaterial to my study's protocols. You have contaminated a research subject. 7 weeks of careful documentation ruined by your interference." Cora stood very still. He was dying. He was providing valuable data about the physiological limits of metabolic adaptation. Now that data is worthless. Do you understand what you've done? She understood perfectly. Daniel Price was removed from the study that afternoon. His mother was contacted. She arrived in the evening, tearful and angry, demanding to know why her son looked like a skeleton. Hospital administrators told her that children sometimes lost weight during serious illness. They released Daniel into her care. Dr. Prescott made a note in his research file. Subject 7, discontinued due to nursing error. Replacement subject required. Mrs. Freeman called Cora into her office at the end of the shift. "You will not make that mistake again. He would have died. That is not your determination to make. Dr. Prescott's research is important. It is funded by respected institutions, and your job is to assist, not to interfere. If you cannot accept that, I will recommend your termination." Cora nodded, said nothing. That night she walked to the church where her mother's funeral had been held. Mount Zion Baptist, a whitewashed building 3 blocks from her boarding house. The pastor, Reverend William Thorne, was locking the front door when she arrived. "Nurse Bennett?" He smiled. "Didn't expect to see you this evening." "I need to speak with you, Reverend, about something I can't tell anyone else." They sat in the empty sanctuary. Cora told him everything. Reverend Thorne was 62 years old. He had been born enslaved on a plantation in northern Mississippi, freed at age 4 when Union troops came through in 1864. He had taught himself to read using a Bible given to him by a Methodist missionary. He had walked to Memphis in 1879 with $17 and a conviction that God's work required more than prayer. Mount Zion Baptist served a congregation of 230 families. Sharecroppers, day laborers, domestic workers. People who lived in constant negotiation with a white world that considered their survival optional. Reverend Thorne had buried children who died from preventable diseases. He had counseled mothers whose sons disappeared into the convict lease system. He had presided over weddings where the couple's legal right to marry had been recognized only 30 years earlier. He listened to Cora's account without interruption. When she finished, he sat silent for a long moment. How many children? 6 at a time. They stay for 12 weeks. Sometimes longer if Dr. Prescott wants to extend the observation period. And the hospital administration knows about this? They approve the research. They accept the funding. They look the other way when parents complain. Reverend Thorne stood and walked to the window. Outside, Beale Street was quiet. A few people walking home from late shifts. A distant streetcar bell. What do you want to do, Sister Bennett? Get them out. The children who are at highest risk. The ones Dr. Prescott won't release even when the protocol calls for it. I can identify them, but I need help placing them somewhere safe. You're talking about kidnapping. I'm talking about saving lives. The Reverend turned back to face her. You understand what happens if you're caught? To you, to anyone who helps you? This isn't just losing your job. This is prison, or worse. I understand. He studied her face, reading something there that satisfied him. Then we'll need to be very careful, and we'll need more people than just us. The network grew slowly. Reverend Thorne recruited 2 deacons whose discretion he trusted absolutely. James Polk, a carpenter who had lost his daughter to scarlet fever when the White Hospital refused to admit her. Marcus Webb, a postal worker who moved through the city unseen, delivering mail to both white and colored neighborhoods. His presence so routine that people forgot he was there. They recruited families willing to take children on short notice. Childless couples, widows, people with resources enough to feed an extra mouth and courage enough to lie to anyone who asked questions. Each family was given a story. The child was a distant relative, an orphan, a grandchild sent north during hard times. Stories that were plausible enough to avoid scrutiny in a community where family structures were fluid and tragedy was common. Cora's role was identification. She selected children who were unlikely to survive the full 12 weeks, children whose weight loss was accelerating, children who showed signs of organ failure, children whom Dr. Prescott was watching with particular clinical interest, noting each decline as evidence for his theories. The method was simple. Cora would alter discharge paperwork, changing dates and adding false authorization signatures. She would tell Mrs. Freeman that Dr. Prescott had approved an early release, citing concerns about a contagious condition that might spread to other subjects. The head nurse never checked. Dr. Prescott visited only twice a week. By the time he noticed a subject was missing, the child would be 10 miles away, living under a different name in a home that claimed him as family. The tags were Cora's innovation. She bought cardboard at a stationery store, cut it into 2-inch squares, punched holes in the corners, threaded them with cotton string. On each tag, she wrote a number sequence, 3 digits, followed by a dash, followed by 4 more digits. Below the numbers, a single word in her neat, cramped handwriting, return. The first 3 digits identified the church family who took the child. James Polk was assigned numbers starting with 101. Marcus Webb's extended family was 201. Other families received their own codes, known only to Cora and Reverend Thorne. The final 4 digits were the admission date, compressed. A child admitted on July 20th, 1923, would be 72023. The word return was insurance. If the child's family ever came looking, if questions were asked years later, if anyone traced the network back to its source. The tag was proof of identity, a way to reconnect a child with their original name and lineage. Most of the families who took the children destroyed the tags immediately, understanding that physical evidence was dangerous. But a few kept them. hidden in Bibles or sewn into quilt linings. The photograph. Cora arranged it deliberately. 2 children she had removed from the research ward in August of 1923. The girl, Mary Ellen Cross, 5 years old, admitted with suspected tuberculosis. The boy, Samuel Franklin, 4 years old, admitted with chronic malnutrition. Both had been selected for Dr. Prescott's study. Both were dying when Cora falsified their discharge papers. She took them to a photographer's studio on Beale Street. Merriweather and Son, a colored-owned business that took portraits for church directories and funeral remembrances. She told the photographer she wanted a formal portrait, herself and 2 patients who had recovered under her care. The photographer asked no questions. Questions were expensive. Samuel wore his tag. The number on it was 101-81323, James Polk's family. Admitted August 13th. The tag hung around his neck on a string that Cora had tied carefully, making sure the writing faced forward, clearly visible. Why photograph evidence of what she was doing? Why create a record that could destroy her? Because Cora understood that memory was unreliable, that families separated by trauma and distance might forget, that children taken at age 4 might not remember their original names by age 14. The photograph was insurance of a different kind, proof that these children existed, proof that someone had saved them, proof that could speak even if everyone involved was silenced. She kept the photograph in her room. She showed it to no one. Between August of 1923 and March of 1925, Cora removed 14 children from Memphis General's colored ward. She placed them with families who raised them as their own. She burned her notebook pages after transcribing the information onto tags. She altered hospital records so carefully that Dr. Prescott never realized his subject pool was being systematically depleted. 14 children, 14 lives, small numbers. But each one was a universe. Dr. Loretta Hayes was 34 years old, a graduate of Meharry Medical College, one of the few institutions that trained Negro physicians. She had been hired by Memphis General in January of 1924 to provide basic care in the colored ward, under the supervision of white attending physicians. She was the first Negro doctor employed by the hospital. Her presence was considered progressive by the white administrators, who hired her at 2/3 the salary of her white colleagues. Dr. Hayes was brilliant, ambitious, and pragmatic. She understood that her position was provisional, that any misstep would be attributed not to her individual failings, but to her race. She performed every procedure flawlessly. She worked longer hours than required. She accepted condescension from white doctors half as qualified. She did everything necessary to protect her position. She noticed what Cora was doing in February of 1924. A child named Robert Mason, 6 years old, had been in the research program for 9 weeks. Dr. Hayes had examined him during evening rounds and noted severe signs of malnutrition. She had written a recommendation in his chart that he be removed from the study and given supplemental nutrition. The next morning, she arrived to find Robert's bed empty. According to the paperwork, he had been discharged at Dr. Prescott's authorization due to contagious impetigo. Dr. Hayes knew that diagnosis was false. She had examined Robert the previous evening. He had no skin condition. She said nothing. 3 weeks later, another child disappeared under similar circumstances. Then a third. The pattern became clear. Children who were failing, who were at risk of dying, suddenly developed contagious conditions that required immediate discharge. Always when Dr. Prescott was off-site. Always with paperwork that looked official, but contained subtle inconsistencies. Dr. Hayes understood what was happening. She also understood that acknowledging it would force her to choose between complicity and consequence. If she reported her suspicions to hospital administration, they would investigate. They would discover Cora's alterations to the records. Cora would be arrested, possibly prosecuted. The children she had placed would be located and returned. And Dr. Hayes's position at Memphis General would become untenable. She would be seen as a troublemaker, someone who couldn't be trusted to maintain the necessary professional detachment. So she said nothing. She saw everything. She documented nothing. She made sure never to be present during evening rounds when discharges happened. Silence purchased with different currency, not money, not power, just the preservation of possibility. The chance to remain in a position where she might someday help in ways that wouldn't destroy her. Years later, in 1967, Dr. Hayes would be interviewed by a journalist writing about the history of Memphis General. By then, she was 67 years old, retired, willing to speak about things she had witnessed. She described the research program in careful terms, noting that such studies were unfortunately common in that era. When asked if anyone had tried to stop it, she hesitated for a long moment before answering. There was a nurse. I don't remember her name. She did what she could. The journalist pressed for details. Dr. Hayes changed the subject. Irene Caldwell began working in the hospital administration office in October of 1932, 9 years after the photograph was taken. She was hired as a filing clerk, responsible for maintaining patient records, processing admissions paperwork, and organizing the hospital's photographic archive. The archive included hundreds of images documenting the hospital's development, new wings under construction, medical equipment demonstrations, staff portraits, historical documentation for future use. Among the materials Irene inherited was a wooden filing cabinet containing unsorted photographs from the previous decade. Most were unremarkable. A few were puzzling. The photograph of Nurse Bennett and the 2 children was filed in a folder labeled Colored Ward Personnel, 1923-1926. No notation explained its significance. The image appeared to be a standard staff photograph. Irene kept it because it represented the hospital's history. She had no idea what the tag around the boy's neck meant. She couldn't have known that the nurse in the photograph had disappeared in March of 1925, or that the circumstances of her disappearance were never officially recorded. The photograph was simply another piece of archival material to be preserved. When Irene retired in 1968, she took the filing cabinet home, a lifetime of accumulated documents. She had always intended to organize them properly, to donate them to a historical society or museum. But retirement filled with other concerns: grandchildren, a husband who developed Parkinson's disease. The filing cabinet sat in a spare bedroom, untouched for decades. After Irene's death in 2017, her daughter Dorothy inherited the house and its contents. She spent months sorting through her mother's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to discard. The photographs seemed important. Historical documents deserved preservation. She contacted the Tennessee Medical History Museum. The photograph traveled 96 years and 147 miles before someone finally looked closely enough to see what Cora had hidden in plain sight. Dr. Sarah Vance began her research in April of 2019, 3 weeks after acquiring the photograph. She started with the nurse. The hospital personnel records were incomplete, but a local genealogist helped her trace employment logs. Nurse C.E. Bennett, hired April 1923, last paycheck dated March 13, 1925. No termination paperwork, no forwarding address. simply absent from the records after that date. Church archives yielded more. Mount Zion Baptist's membership rolls listed Cora Elizabeth Bennett, joining date September 1922. Her mother's death certificate was filed with the county, dated April 2nd, 1923. A newspaper obituary mentioned that Cora was a graduate of Freedman's Hospital School of Nursing, returning to Memphis to care for her ailing mother. Sarah found the children next. The boy in the photograph, Samuel Franklin, admitted to Memphis General on August 13, 1923, according to intake logs. But discharge records showed him leaving on August 15. 2 days. Impossibly short for a child admitted to the research program, which required a minimum stay of 12 weeks. She cross-referenced admission dates with discharge dates for all children admitted to the colored ward between January 1923 and December 1924. She found 14 cases where children admitted to research beds were discharged within days, all with diagnoses of contagious conditions. All during periods when Dr. Prescott was documented as being off-site. The tag code, 101-81323. Sarah spent 3 days trying to crack it before the pattern revealed itself. The first 3 digits were an identifier. The last 4 were a compressed date. August 13th, 23. Samuel's admission date. But who was 101? Church records again. Mount Zion's deacon board in 1923 included a man named James Polk. His address, 101 Linden Street. Sarah felt her pulse accelerate. If 101 identified the Polk family, then other numbers might identify other families, other addresses, other children. She compiled a list of every deacon, every family mentioned in the church's records from that era. She mapped their addresses against the 3-digit codes she could extract from hospital records. She found 7 probable placements. Samuel Franklin's birth family was harder to trace. His mother's name appeared on intake forms. Ruth Franklin, address listed as general delivery. Transient, possibly homeless. Sarah searched census records, death certificates, marriage licenses. She found a Ruth Franklin who died in Memphis in 1947, aged 53, of pneumonia. The death certificate listed no surviving family, but the tag's word, return, implied that Samuel could be returned somewhere, to someone. Sarah expanded her search. She looked for anyone named Franklin in Memphis census records from the 1930s and 40s. She found 12. She cross-referenced their ages, looking for someone born around 1919. She found him. Samuel Franklin Jr., born 1919, raised by a family named Polk, later adopted formally. Name changed to Samuel Polk in 1931. He served in World War II, returned to Memphis, worked as a postal carrier for 33 years, retired in 1986, died in 2003. He had 3 children, 8 grandchildren, 16 great-grandchildren. Sarah contacted the eldest grandchild, a woman named Patricia Chambers, in June of 2019. What Cora left behind was sparse by design. 14 children rescued, 14 tags created, most destroyed. 1 photograph preserved by accident, and 1 notebook, hidden so well it wasn't found until 2020, when renovations at Mount Zion Baptist revealed a loose brick in the basement wall. The notebook was small, 3 inches by 5, with a soft leather cover. Water damage had made some pages illegible, but 47 entries remained readable. Names, admission dates, placement codes, and notes in Cora's handwriting. Entry dated November 3, 1924. David Harper, age 7, admitted Sep 12. Weight 41 lbs at admission, 29 lbs today. Prescott notes excellent metabolic adaptation. Child cannot walk without assistance. Coded 204. J. Webb's sister in Covington. Must move him this week. Entry dated January 19, 1925. 3 children currently behind curtain showing severe decline. Hospital administration questioned by Harper family, but Prescott convinced them child contracted dysentery and died at home. No investigation. Getting more difficult to falsify records. Mrs. Freeman watching closer. May need to stop soon. Final entry, dated March 7, 1925. Subject count declining. Prescott suspicious. Told Reverend Thorne to suspend operations until situation stabilizes. Will continue documentation in case needed later as evidence. No entry explained what happened to Cora after March 13th, when her final paycheck was issued. Mrs. Freeman's notes in the nursing log mentioned only that Nurse Bennett had resigned without notice. Hospital administrators made no effort to investigate. Negro nurses left positions frequently. The turnover was unremarkable, but Reverend Thorne's diary, preserved in church archives, contained one entry from March 15, 1925. Sister Bennett departed this morning. Prayed with her before she left. God willing, she will find safety where she's going. Her work here will echo longer than any of us will live to see. Sarah found no death certificate for Cora Elizabeth Bennett in Tennessee. She expanded her search to neighboring states: Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. Nothing. She searched northern cities where Negro women might have migrated: Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia. No matches. It was possible Cora had changed her name. Possible she had died young, her death unrecorded. Possible she had simply vanished into the vast population of black women whose lives were never systematically documented. Or possible she had lived a long, quiet life somewhere far from Memphis, carrying the knowledge of 14 children saved and the ghosts of all the ones she couldn't reach. Patricia Chambers stood in Sarah's museum office in July of 2019, holding the photograph that showed her grandfather at age 4, wearing a cardboard tag around his neck. She was 51 years old, a high school history teacher in Memphis. She had known her grandfather well before his death 16 years earlier. He had never mentioned being sick as a child, never mentioned a hospital stay, never mentioned a nurse who saved his life. He told us he was born in Covington, Patricia said. Raised by the Polk family, who were distant cousins of his mother's. She died when he was young, and they took him in. That's what we always knew. Did he ever mention Ruth Franklin, his birth mother? Never. I didn't even know her name until you contacted me. Sarah showed her the hospital intake records. Samuel Franklin, age 4, admitted August 13, 1923. Mother's name, Ruth Franklin. Diagnosis, failure to thrive. Admitted to research program for nutritional study. Patricia's hands trembled as she read the documents. They were starving him, on purpose. Yes. And this nurse got him out. She saved 14 children that we know of, possibly more. The records are incomplete. Patricia looked again at the photograph, at the young woman in the nurse's uniform, her face serious, her hands resting protectively on the children's shoulders. What happened to her? We don't know. She disappeared in March of 1925. No records after that. The story spread through the network of descendants. Patricia contacted other families, using the church records Sarah had compiled. 7 of the 14 children Cora had saved lived to adulthood. They had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. By September of 2019, Sarah had identified 63 living descendants of Cora's rescues. They gathered at Mount Zion Baptist on October 12, 2019, 94 years after Cora last attended service there. 63 people who existed because a nurse had decided that silence cost more than courage. They shared stories about grandparents who had lived full lives, unaware of how close they had come to dying in a hospital research ward at age 5 or 6 or 7. One woman, Denise Harper, brought a quilt. Her grandmother had sewn it in the 1950s, using fabric scraps from family clothing. In one corner, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, a small square of cardboard was stitched into the lining. The tag read, 204912224. Her grandfather, David Harper, the child from Cora's November 3rd entry. Grandma told me once that this tag was important, Denise said. She never explained why. Just said it was part of our family history, and I should keep it safe. Evidence hidden in fabric. Truth preserved in the only way people without power could preserve it. Through memory, through objects given meaning that outsiders would never recognize. Dr. Howard Prescott's research continued until 1934. His study of nutritional requirements in Negro children was cited in medical journals through the 1950s. His papers influenced public health policy in several southern states, where reduced caloric recommendations for Negro school children were implemented based on his findings. He died in 1958, age 78, honored at his funeral as a pioneering researcher who had dedicated his life to improving health outcomes for underprivileged populations. His research subjects were never named in his publications. They appeared only as data points, numbered entries in tables showing weight loss, deficiency symptoms, and mortality rates. Subject 4, Subject 15, Subject 23. Numbers that erased identity while documenting suffering. Cora's tags reversed that erasure. Her numbers carried identity forward. They encoded information that could reconnect severed lineages. They proved that the children behind those numbers were human beings, with names, with families, with lives that continued beyond the research ward. Memphis General Hospital closed its colored ward in 1965, following the passage of the Civil Rights Act that prohibited segregated medical facilities. The building that housed the ward was demolished in 1972. Nothing marks the location today except a parking lot and a historical marker noting that Memphis General once occupied this site. The hospital's archives contain no mention of Cora Elizabeth Bennett's rescue operation. The official history includes a paragraph about Dr. Prescott's research program, describing it as representative of the scientific standards of its era, and noting that such studies contributed to our understanding of nutritional requirements, though modern ethical standards would prohibit similar research. Measured language, sanitized horror. But the descendants remember. They maintain a private archive now, collecting stories and documents that the official record omits. The photograph that Sarah found has been digitally reproduced and distributed to every family. It hangs in living rooms and church halls across Memphis. A reminder, a warning, a testament to the power of one person who refused to accept that following orders was the same as doing right. Sarah's research was published in the Journal of Medical History in March of 2020. The article, titled "Resistance in the Shadow of Eugenics: One Nurse's Covert Operation in Memphis, 1923-1925, documented Cora's rescue network in careful detail. It named the children she saved. It described the systems that made Dr. Prescott's research possible. It acknowledged Dr. Hayes's silence and examined its cost. The article concluded, Cora Bennett's actions remind us that individual resistance matters, even when, especially when, it operates outside official channels and leaves minimal historical trace. The children she saved lived full lives. They had families, They contributed to their communities. They existed. That existence is testimony more powerful than any document. The photograph hangs now in the Tennessee Medical History Museum's permanent collection. Visitors stop in front of it, reading the placard that explains what they're seeing. A nurse who committed systematic fraud to save children from death by starvation. A tag that encoded identity and numbers. A single image that documented a crime that saved lives. Some visitors cry. Some ask questions. Some take photographs of their own, sharing the image on social media with captions that try to capture the enormity of what Cora did. The post goes viral periodically. Thousands of strangers learn about a nurse they never heard of, who saved children they never met 90 years ago in a city most of them will never visit. The photograph has become a talisman, evidence that one person can matter, that small acts of courage accumulate into salvation, that systems built on cruelty depend on universal compliance, and the refusal of even one person creates cracks through which others can escape. Patricia Chambers visits the museum once a month. She brings her grandchildren, shows them the photograph of their great-great-grandfather at age 4, wearing a tag that saved his life. She tells them about Cora Bennett, about the 14 children, about the descendants who gather each October at Mount Zion Baptist to remember. She didn't know us, Patricia tells her grandchildren. She never knew how many people would exist because of what she did. She just knew what was right in that moment, and she did it, even though it could have killed her. In December of 2023, construction workers renovating a building on Madison Avenue found human remains buried in the basement. Forensic analysis dated the bones to the early 20th century. Further investigation revealed the building had once been connected to Memphis General Hospital's colored ward by an underground tunnel. The remains belonged to at least 6 children, aged between 4 and 9, showing signs of severe malnutrition. Dr. Prescott's missing subjects, the ones who didn't survive, the ones whose deaths were never officially recorded. Evidence buried for a century finally coming to light. The discovery prompted renewed interest in Cora's story. A documentary filmmaker began work on a project about her rescue operation. A playwright wrote a one-woman show based on her notebooks. A novelist is composing a fictionalized account, imagining the inner life of a woman whose courage left almost no historical trace. And somewhere in Memphis, an elderly woman tells her great-niece about a grandmother she never met, who once worked as a nurse and then disappeared, leaving behind only stories whispered in kitchens, about children saved, and a photograph that proved what people in power would rather forget. The photograph lives. The children's descendants live. The memory lives, carried forward by people who understand that history is not just what gets written down, but what gets remembered, spoken, honored, and passed on. Some say that if you visit Memphis General's old site on October 12th, the anniversary of the gathering, you can still hear children's voices singing hymns from Mount Zion Baptist 3 blocks away. A haunting that sounds like joy, a ghost story that ends with life instead of death. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.